be seated. So this morning we are continuing our series on building and considering how we build toward harmony. We began several weeks ago by looking at building in the void and the empty spaces that are in our lives, the places where we need to find what it is that is missing and build. We continued by considering the hard work of truly seeking to grow. Some call that work discipleship, others call it personal growth or development. We talked about how that takes effort and intentionality and time. Then last week we considered our past. I told you the story of the arson of the upstairs lounge now 40 years ago. And we considered what formative and instructive instructive stories, what history it is that we want to take and carry forward with us into our future, so that we can live a future that is informed by the past. And today we build harmony. The most important thing here at the outset in talking about building harmony that I want to make sure you hear from me is that I am not talking about building unity. We are building harmony, a word that inherently describes different sounds, different tones, different pitches, blending together to create beauty. It's not about unison. It's about the harmony of different voices. The different elements, what different elements can we build together and create beauty? As most of you know, my grandmother died 1 week ago today, and I have spent this past week with Kevin and the rest of my family, mourning her loss, speaking at her funeral, and praying at her graveside. For the many of you who have been praying this week and sending cards and things, I appreciate that. It all went well except for my aunt's behavior. But as you might expect, I'd like to take a little bit of time this morning in talking about harmony and use some examples from the life of my grandmother and hope that they will be a blessing to you. So my grandmother was born in 1924 in Florence, Alabama. She died at 88. She was the first child that her parents had, but only the first of a total of 8 children. They were busy. When my grandmother was about 13 years old, her father was working in a barn slaughtering hogs. This is very rural Alabama. And when he went up to the loft to remove some of the equipment that they had been using, he fell from the loft and landed on his head and died. He left behind his wife, 7 children, and 2 months later, his last daughter, who was still unborn at the time of his death. Earlier that day, my grandmother had bought this brand new red raincoat, one of those kind of almost plasticky types, totally meant for rain. And they didn't buy new things as a general rule. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later, but this was like a once-a-year purchase, so she was super excited about having her raincoat. But when the family got the news of what had happened, they were going to go over to a neighbor's house that evening. My great-grandmother had already cooked a pot of soup, and so they decided that they would take that with them. The neighbor came over, the neighbor had a car, so they all loaded up in the car, and my grandmother was asked to hold the pot of soup. So she sat in our lap, they drove over, and when she got there, she realized that the soup pot had melted her plastic raincoat. And so it was one of her most poignant memories of that day of losing her father, that not only had she lost her father, but she was terrified. You would think she would be upset as a little girl, but she was actually scared to tell anybody that in the midst of all of this, the coat that they saved up all this money to buy, she had ruined it. So the red raincoat was a big moment in her life. It symbolized, I think, that everything went wrong that day. My great-grandfather was just 33 years old at the time of his death, as old as I am now. And having 7 kids and one on the way at 33 is frightening enough. That is a different world than we live in. But his wife, my great-grandmother, ended up living to the age of 95, and I got to know her well because of that. She was only 31 at the time of his death, and she never remarried in all those 95 years. Instead, she became sort of the symbol of our family, and in many ways began to, I think her life from that point on had a lot to do with determining the lives of my family members. she became this matriarch and this example of strong feminine leadership that was passed on to generations upon generations. My grandmother, my mother, and on and on. She raised those 8 kids with a level of determination and grit that is unmatched in our world today. It included things that we would expect, teaching them godliness and cleanliness and how to work. But it also included other things that we might not expect as much, which include things like defending her home with a shotgun when she needed to in southern Alabama. My grandmother entered the workplace almost immediately after her father's death. You know, labor laws were different then. Even though she was young, she could still go to work. And she began working at a drugstore that had a soda fountain inside of it. The family was already poor before all of this, and now their lives were literally in jeopardy, and with real questions about how they were going to afford to eat. My grandmother's youngest sister, the one that was in the womb when her dad died, told us the story of going to church with my great-grandma Robinson years ago, and they were talking about being giving. And my great-grandmother Robinson told a story of a woman who was also a single mother at that time, who had kids and was worse off, if it was possible, than them, came to the house needing flour to be able to make biscuits for the kids to have breakfast one particular morning. My great-grandmother had 2 cups of flour left, and that's what she was going to use to make breakfast the next day. But she gave it to the woman anyways because her kids were going hungry that day. And she had no idea how she would feed her kids the next day. But later on that same day, the grocery man came around and dropped off several bags of groceries for her for free. And it included a 5-pound bag of flour. And for her, it was an example of God just caring for her, even if she didn't know how that was going to happen. They had a 1-acre piece of property in like Alabama that they lived on. It was literally the house they lived in was a tar paper shack. When it snowed, the kids' beds would have snow on them because it would come right into the house. They had 2 beds, so all the boys slept in one bed and all the girls slept in another. It was one bed, one room kind of place. The kids all got 1 pair of shoes each fall, and they wore them through the fall and the winter, and then when it came springtime, they'd just go barefoot until the next fall, once ago. It wasn't always a friendly place, like I say. There were multiple stories of, well, number one, the boys getting into plenty of trouble, and then Grandma having to use the shotgun to ensure that the family stayed safe afterwards. She would stand out there and say, if you want to come inside, you can, but you'll leave with buckshot in you. She also did not take kindly to suitors, nor did her kids, and on more than one occasion she told one of them to leave with a gun as well.